the secret sauce can't be revealed for so many of these organizations that they've been putting millions and millions of dollars into investing and testing and experimenting with. And so information clearance is critical, that you have legal NDA protections. And it's a little bit like the good fences make good neighbors analogy, in that you're working with vendor companies and partner companies. And is there an NDA in place? Good, then we can proceed. A lot of the times this is overlooked and, oh, forgot to check about NDA. Forgot to check if Reg Affairs requires it for me to send you documents. Then several days or a week is lost, sometimes more if the right contact isn't in the office. And time is the real enemy here. This is a big race when it comes to translation and information and patient enrollment and drug testing. Time is the enemy. So anytime there's unnecessary delays that could be prevented, it's a pity and it's a setback. And it sets the stage for other delays and offshoots because we're rushing to catch up as a result of that. So one of the first foundational best practices is to make sure that non-disclosure has been carried out before documents can be released to a translation party or other vendors. So this comes down to risk mitigation and who owns the documents. In this era of multiple company outsourcing and multiple company partnerships, often the original authors or owners of the documents are several steps removed. So a middle company intervening is going to assign documents for translation when inherently they may not have the rights to be altered or translated. We're talking about survey instruments a lot of the times, copyrighted documents, documents from academic or university institutions. So someone has to chase down whether or not translation rights have been granted before the documents can be translated. A lot of the times this gets skipped and individuals say, well, we're going to take our chances. No one's going to know. The problem with the written word is that once it's out there permanently. So this is a big problem. And a lot of translators should put out a bold, harmless statement of some sort saying, we assume that you obtained rights for translation release. We can't be held responsible if you did not. So that's why it's a best practice to make sure for copyrighted documents, trademark documents, surveys and instruments, those types of particular specialized documents, that translation rights have been granted and there's not going to be any problems after the fact. Yes, it's a great idea to introduce the different parties involved, whether it's a sponsor pharmaceutical, whether it's CRO, IRB contact, whether it's somebody in printing, regulatory affairs, whether it's a colleague that's going to be available in your absence. Who's going to be copied on what emails and at what stage during the translation project? How do you want it to unfold? If it's a larger translation encompassing several weeks or several months, it would be a great idea to have a kickoff meeting with the translators and all of the stakeholders involved. We're all pulling on the same side of the rope. We're all advocating for the same good results and to make introductions. So it's a great idea. It's a best practice to identify the stakeholders of a translation and to identify who's going to receive the goods. So it's a problem because a lot of medical writers and managers are using file names as a de facto file management system. Approved, date, version number 2. I had green eggs and ham for breakfast at site number Dr. Jones. Da, 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 da. I'm poking fun a little bit at writers who do this. They have a system that they know, but it's only in their heads. And when you try to share and disseminate this with translators and other parties and vendors, that's where it gets a little bit muddled. You could have situations where computers will truncate and shorten the file names automatically. Then it becomes useless. You could have situations like software crashes and computer crashes due to excessively long file names, maybe exceeding character limit restrictions in certain portals and FTP areas. So it's just a good practice to have shorter file names that are more intuitive, simpler to understand for everyone's benefit. So it could be a situation where you have documents that are similarly named. At first glance, you're trying to understand what the differences are between these long file names. If you have 4 documents, if you have 8, 10, 12, 15 documents with similar file names, or they're not intuitive, that's one thing if you're the English writer or manager controlling those. But what if this is being translated into 2 languages, 10 languages, 20 languages? with English back translations. All of a sudden, we're dealing with dozens and hundreds of files. So I recommend that you consider adopting a practice of simply putting a number in front of your source English documents, 1 through 10, 1 through 5, whatever it might be. Then we can say, hey, we're still awaiting Spanish numbers 2 and 6. Is that correct? Not, we're still awaiting a really long file name. Very easy to manage, and it's a much simpler system for everyone to understand by referencing the number instead of the file name. So you want your localized translated files to be mirror images of the English file set. So the complete file set should be provided at the start of a translation effort. And usually that's in the form of what's called a desktop publishing package or DTP package. This is going to include the fonts, the graphics, the Adobe InDesign file, the supporting documents as a whole can easily be rounded up and provided to the translator. Really, there's not much of an excuse to locate and identify and send these. They usually aren't that large in file size, and it's a much safer way of avoiding errors. If you're having to recreate a document from PDF only, that can be done these days without too much trouble, but you're risking font substitution. You're risking different printer settings that won't be observed. Lots and lots of things that could go wrong. So just provide the complete DTP file package to begin with. Who owns the data? That's the question with everything these days. Who has the rights for it? Whose content is it? Translators use what's called translation memory tools. That's a very common practice if you're involved in translation and documentation. It's for version control. It's for cost reduction. It's for efficiency. So the path that translators take to get you your translated document might be the path that they choose to take and the tools that they choose to use. You should have an agreement up front ahead of time as to whether or not the translator is going to turn over their translation memory data as part of the deliverables or not. Some translators are agreeable to this. Others consider it a part of their intellectual property, and it's something that must be paid for. Simple as that. Well, the first thing I would say is that translation does not mean the same thing to all people. It's a commonly held belief. And when you think about it and push people a little bit, they say, well, I don't know. They just translate it, right? Doesn't that mean the same thing? If you ask 100 different people for their opinion on what translation means to them, maybe you don't get 100 different opinions, but you'll get dozens of different opinions. Oh, I'm going to translate it so that it doesn't sound like a translation you'd never know. Oh, I'm going to literally translate it because these are chemical compounds and scientific expressions that must be very literal. What is your translation style that you prefer? You've got to talk about what the translator's approach and language conventions are. What is their translation philosophy? That is the simplest but most powerful thing that you can ask of a translator ahead of time. Tell me about your translation philosophy. I want to make sure it jives with what we want. It all starts at the beginning in defining if your translation is a success, how will you know? What's the goal of the translation? What's the objective behind doing it to begin with? Are you seeking to understand a competitor's warranty information? Are you seeking to have scientific content translated into English? Are you seeking to comply with regulatory rules for patient guidelines and so forth with a HIPAA document or a consent form document? Are you seeking to boost patient enrollment in a study by having effective translations of patient recruitment documents, and therefore you can have a little bit more marketing flair? But how will you know if the translation was a success? If the answer is, well, we didn't get any complaints, well, that's one answer. But always just write out, even if it's simple, what the goal of my translation is, why I'm doing it to begin with. And if you share that with the translator, your chances of success are going to go up. This is by far the number one biggest piece of information that you need to share with the translator. When do you need the translation by? Make sure that you say the day and the date. Make sure that you get it in writing, and make sure that you get confirmation that the translator will be able to deliver by then. Failure to do this is by far the mother of all communication breakdowns.